Scott, recently a Ukrainian general by the name of Sergei Melnik, Melnik, is quoted as saying that Kyiv needs up to 6 times, Ukrainian general, up to 6 times more troops and firepower than Russia has for its so-called counteroffensive to succeed. That's not even conceivable, is it?
No, not even close. That's, in short, he's saying we can't do it.
And Larry Johnson thinks this fellow may be retired. I don't know if you know him or know of him, but how or why is a Ukrainian general, present or former, getting away with making a statement like that? This is in a Spanish newspaper called El País.
My understanding he's retired. He's not active, but he's not alone. There is an active Ukrainian lieutenant general, I believe, who has pretty much said something similar to that, meaning that that Ukraine is not in a position to begin this much vaunted counteroffensive until they receive more equipment, more material. He didn't give the figure of 6 times. I think that's Melnik's own personal calculations based upon the realities of the battlefield, because normally you want a 3-to-1 advantage if you're going to be carrying out an attack of this nature. But I think what he's saying with the 6 times is in order to pin down the Russians on the totality of the line of contact to prevent reinforcements, et cetera, Ukraine's going to need 6 times as many resources as it currently has.
What are the respective force strengths now, numerically?
Well, I mean, the Russians are probably hovering around 500, 600,000, and the Ukrainians are probably in the area of 600,000. But again, Ukrainian troops, the vast majority of them are poorly trained territorials, and all of the Russians are well-trained, well-equipped, well-rested.
Our mutual friend, Alistair Crook, tells us that he is hearing that the Ukrainians are bringing trainees, 4 weeks of training, 16 and 17-year-olds, to the front at night in the dark, telling them to go to sleep. And when they wake up, they can see the Russian guns and they run away. Well, you obviously can't. If that's true, you can't run a military like that.
No, you can't. Look, the fact of the matter is Ukraine had an army, an active regular force of 260,000 when this war began. And 80% of those original 260,000 well-trained, well-equipped, well-led forces, 80% are killed, captured, or wounded. They're gone. And they're not being replaced with troops anywhere near the same level of training. And in addition to that, Ukraine has had to, mobilize territorial brigades, reserve units, and these units are being eviscerated at the front line. It's not a survivable situation for these Ukrainian troops. It's tragic. I think Colonel McGregor, our mutual friend and a man I deeply respect, said it has transitioned away from, and I might be paraphrasing him, but it's transitioned away from a slaughter to literally a humanitarian disaster. That you can't even call this war anymore. What's going on there? It's just tragic what's going on, because the Ukrainians can't defend against what the Russians are putting up against.
So President Zelensky's vaunted spring offensive, it's not going to happen.
It can't happen. I mean, they may try something. They have assembled some forces, a lot of political pressure on them, especially from the British, to be seen as doing something in order to be able to convince Europe to continue putting resources into this. But they've lost all their air defense on the front lines. They have nothing. So,
right.
They used to be able to assemble forces under the cover of air defense and then bring those forces to the front lines. Now, as they assemble them 15, 20 kilometers back, the Russians detect it, and the Russians are hitting them with 1,000, 1,500 pound bombs, precision guided bombs right in the middle of the assembly area. And these forces are being murdered before they even get a chance to get near the front lines.
Just as we were coming on air, Secretary General Stoltenberg issued a statement. We have the translation. Here it is. More than 98% of the combat vehicles promised to Ukraine have already been delivered. That means over 1,500 armored vehicles, 230 tanks, and other equipment, including vast amounts of ammunition. What the heck do they have left?
Well, I mean, this stuff has been delivered. I think we should point out that many of the Leopard tanks that have been delivered can't go to the front lines because they broke down as soon as they arrived. They're now being stored in the rear with to be used as spare parts to cannibalize them to get some of the ones that were delivered ready to roll. And it's not just equipment, though. You have to talk about the people who operate them. Have they been sufficiently trained? And the fact of the matter is, this stuff isn't going to survive. Much of it has already been destroyed. I mean, he can say it's been delivered. What he didn't talk about is the warehouses where these are put in. The Russians are blowing up. A lot of this equipment is destroyed before it even gets anywhere near the front line.
All right. So how dire is the tactical situation for the Ukrainian military? Now, you have told us before you answer, they have a general who is respected worldwide in the military, but he's only as good as the people that work for him. But how dire is their situation?
It's extraordinarily dire. To give you an example, in the battle for Mariupol, the Ukrainians were able to, they'd make strong points of these high-rise buildings. And the Russians, the tactic the Russians used was to assault the building because they had to inspect the base, make sure there were no civilians there. And then they'd fight floor by floor by floor, very bloody fighting. And the Ukrainians, even though they lost, they were giving the Russians a hard time. In Bakhmut, for example, the Russians are confirming that the civilians have been evacuated, and the Ukrainians are putting a couple hundred guys into these high-rise buildings waiting for the Russians to come and fight. The Russians just pull back, hit it with a 2,000-pound bomb, drop the whole building, kill everybody. The Russians aren't playing the game anymore. They're not. The Russians are taking advantage of the fact that there is no air defense, and they're just holding back. They're just blowing everything up, killing you can't even really call it combat. I mean, this is the ideal. Colin Powell once said, I don't believe in a fair fight. I don't want a fair fight. And the Russians right now, it ain't a fair fight, is becoming greater. Whereas during the Battle of Mariupol, the Russians did not habitually drop entire apartment buildings. They would actually send their troops in to take the building, very bloody fighting. And then they'd give the people in the basement a chance to surrender. Now the Russians come forward, and if the Ukrainians have turned an apartment block into a fortified zone, they pull back and they drop a 1,500-pound bomb on it and drop the whole building, killing everybody inside. They're doing that over and over again. The Ukrainians used to be able to assemble troops about 15 kilometers behind the front line, concentrate them before sending them in to fight as a coherent force. Now, as they assemble them, the Russians are detecting it, and they're dropping the 1,500-pound bomb right on those troops, killing everybody. The Ukrainians can't concentrate their forces. Their artillery is being destroyed piecemeal by drones that are operating freely without any interference. And the Ukrainians are running out of artillery ammunition, so they can't even defend their troops in the trenches. And trench warfare is hell, excuse my language. It is a living hell. This war, I mean, war is, again, Tecumseh Sherman said it, war is hell. I forget, there was another general that said, thank goodness the war is so bad as it is because we grow to love it. Maybe Ulysses Grant said that, but this is all true. We know this, but this is a special kind of hell. This is Dante's Inferno 20 times over for the Ukrainian soldiers. And to be blunt, we're to blame. The American people are to blame because we have allowed our government to create this situation. This war is happening because of American policies, only because of American policies. And we have poured so much money and so much material into this war. We've kept it going longer than it naturally should have. This war should have been over a long time ago. Ukraine was never going to win this war. Russia was always going to win this war. What we've done is prolonged this conflict, ensuring that hundreds of thousands of more Ukrainians die, tens of millions of Ukrainians are displaced, homes are destroyed, cities are destroyed, towns are destroyed, and all the while we're balancing on the precipice of a nuclear conflict that could put us at risk as well. But McGregor is 100% correct. This is a humanitarian disaster, and the best thing we could do is bring an end to it. And the easiest way to end this war is to cut off the supplies to Ukraine and force them to go to the negotiating table. They're on life support right now, and all we're doing is pumping, artificially, stimulated life to a body that shouldn't be alive. We need to unplug it, get it done, and let Ukraine move on and try and recover as much as they can.
Do you think Volodymyr Zelensky had NATO's permission to reach out to China to try to broker peace, or is he seeing the writing on the wall and he's like, NATO's just going to keep encouraging us to fight and send weapons. We need to end this. We've got to turn to China. Where do you think this phone call came from? Permission, no permission, desperation?
Well, first of all, you can't pick up a phone and call somebody if they haven't given you the number. So I think we have to start with the fact that what we're seeing here isn't Ukrainian diplomacy, it's Chinese diplomacy. And I think we both know Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst, a very good man. And Ray has repeatedly lambasted the fact that where is American diplomacy? I mean, why isn't Zelensky calling Washington, D.C. to bring an end to this war? Because we're not in the business of ending the war. China has suddenly, apparently discovered the secret diplomatic, sauce. They went into the Middle East and they did something that nobody even thought about, which was to bring Saudi Arabia and Iran together and create peace. China's working with Russia to bring the Saudis to Syria and bring an end to that conflict. Peace is breaking out all over and has a Chinese accent to it. And so China now has come in. They had, Xi Jinping flew to Moscow, had that 3-day meeting with Vladimir Putin, and before that they put out a 12-point peace plan. And everybody's like, well, that's not going to work. That's not the point. Diplomacy is never solved by the first piece of paper put on the table. Anybody who's ever been involved in a negotiation understands that that's simply a starting point that begins a dialogue that ends with something that is achievable. So the Chinese put something on the table that nobody else was. Where was the American 12-point plan? Where's the European 12-point plan? They don't exist. China put it on the table and forced people to look at it. And now Zelensky, again, looking at reality, Zelensky is realizing that there's nothing the West can do now to save him. They're out of everything. And the Russians are getting everything. And their only hope now is to find a negotiated settlement. I think that he believes the Chinese have more leverage over the Russians than they actually do. Because China has said, we're not here to dictate outcomes. So China's not going to put pressure on Russia. But what China will do, I believe, is promise Zelensky that the best he can hope for is to rebuild what he retained, meaning the territories that he's lost, he's not going to get back. But if you expect Europe and the United States to rebuild your destroyed nation, you are waiting in vain. They've already put $200 billion into you. They're not going to put any more. When this war is done, they're done. So China is your only savior. And I think what the Chinese are saying is bring an end to this conflict on terms that Russia will accept, and we will work to rebuild your country. We will work with you to rebuild your country. But if you don't make peace on terms that Russia can accept, you'll be left to your own devices. And it's going to take a little bit of time for this to percolate with Zelensky, but ultimately that's his only viable option out. And again, I know there's some people out there that get frustrated because China's doing this, China's doing that, but they're only able to do it because there's no competitor. Where's American diplomacy? All we bring to the table is war, 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 war. China's coming in and saying, well, look, the best thing is for us to have economic relations. We mutually benefit. We both get, growing economies. Peace is breaking out all over. And enough people in the world are just tired of decade after decade after decade of war. We in America don't know war. We think we know war, but we don't know war. We live in a wonderfully prosperous nation that's been free of the death and destruction that large-scale war brings. The rest of the world, however, they know war firsthand, and they're exhausted by it. And because America's not providing that alternative, that diplomatic solution, all we offer is more war. China is able to come in and look what they're doing. I mean, how can you argue against, let's remove the Chinese accent from it. How can you argue against peace?
There's been this vacuum created, and I don't know, I don't want to become political. I know that you have your own thoughts or whatever, but it does seem that the Biden administration doesn't want to do diplomacy, or maybe they're not good at it. I don't know, but America used to be known for being good diplomats. And now it's like they just hang up the phone. They don't want the communication happening.
Nixon went to China. Trump went to North Korea. But where's Biden going? And again, I'm not going to get political. I'll respect that. I'm not here to score political points, but where we need, and I think the problem here is that the world has changed since Richard Nixon went to China. The world has even changed since Donald Trump went to North Korea. We're in a situation right now where the United States is in retrograde. The American empire is falling down. The dollar is not strong. People are dumping the dollar, going for other alternative currencies. There's this BRICS economic forum that's standing up and challenging the G7. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is challenging the transatlantic relationship between the United States and Europe. And the Biden administration seems to be locked in the past. If you read their foreign policies, they talk about the importance of sustaining the rules-based international order, which of course is something that could work. But the war's been over for 8 decades now. The world is changing, and the Biden administration seems to be slow about adapting to new realities. The best thing you can do is get ahead of this change and seek to impose your vision, your face, your fingerprints on whatever this change is going to be. But we're not doing that. We're back here trying to slow down the change. The Chinese are the ones getting ahead of it, putting their fingerprint on it.
Yeah. Well, maybe the White House doesn't want Biden going out and talking to people. They barely even let the press ask him questions here in the United States. So thank you so much, Scott. This has been a great discussion. Thank you so much for coming on today's show.
Thank you very much for having me.